The third anniversary of Oliver's death happened to fall on the exact day of my master's thesis defense. As I stood at the podium, fluently presenting my research to the audience, a sudden memory flashed through my mind. I remembered my undergraduate commencement ceremony 3 years ago. He had been sitting in the audience, wearing the same black graduation cap as me, proudly flashing me a thumbs up. After receiving my master's degree, I ignored everyone's objections and traveled to Indonesia. When I arrived in Indonesia, most of the country had just been battered by days of continuous, heavy rain. The moment I stepped off the plane, I grabbed my black suitcase and immediately transferred to a bus, without stopping to rest. Because of the downpours, the roads were relentlessly muddy, and the driver navigated with extreme caution, terrified of hitting a washed-out section. After several grueling transfers, I finally reached my destination, a small town right by the Indian Ocean. Surprisingly, the sun was shining brilliantly here. Massive trees lining the road, whose names I didn't even know, were lush and full of leaves, and I found myself utterly stunned by the vibrant, thriving scenery. 3 years ago, I had watched the news coverage countless times, staring at the devastated landscape of this very place after the tsunami, where nothing remained but shattered walls and ruins. The reported magnitude of the earthquake kept updating until it was finally confirmed at a 9.3. It was only then that I truly understood that when Mother Nature unleashes her fury, the human world becomes a literal hell. I still remember when Oliver first arrived in Indonesia. He couldn't get used to the local food at all, living on nothing but curry and yogurt. He wrote me a postcard saying, "Vera, I never thought I'd miss your cooking this much. Turns out even burnt food sounds good from here." At the time, I was genuinely annoyed that he was thousands of miles away and still hadn't forgotten to mock my terrible cooking skills. I had put the postcard down, pulled a cookbook from the shelf, and silently vowed to myself that I would blow him away with a home-cooked meal the moment he returned. I then spent an entire afternoon making a mess of the kitchen, only to end up tearing my hair out over a foul-smelling pan of overcooked salmon. Whatever, I thought in frustration. As long as one of us was good in the kitchen, that was enough. Oliver and I grew up on the exact same block and attended the same school since childhood. Even though we didn't go to the same college, we still ended up in the same city. We had spent 12 years sitting in the same classrooms, always just an arm's reach away. I always felt that calling us childhood sweethearts didn't even begin to cover it. The funny thing is, we actually hated each other growing up. He was a beautiful kid, so I constantly teased him by calling him a pretty boy, while he ruthlessly fired back by calling me a tomboy. We were always at each other's throats, and our grudge grew so deep that our teachers eventually forced me to move to the opposite side of the classroom. But out of pure stubbornness, I would just drag my chair right back. Even my dad couldn't help but lecture me, asking why I was always going out of my way to provoke the Moran boy. He said I acted just like what? I had asked, but my dad never finished his sentence. A long time later, I suddenly realized what he meant. I was acting just like a little punk who relentlessly bothers the girl he secretly has a crush on, completely unable to stop himself. But that realization only came to me long after Oliver had passed away. I folded up the postcard where he mocked my cooking and stopped by a roadside church to light a candle for him. I knew him better than anyone. He was spoiled and useless, bringing nothing to the table except his good looks, so I figured maybe lighting a candle would keep him from getting food poisoning from the chicken curry. But before he could ever come home, I received the devastating news of his death. The sudden Indian Ocean tsunami, with its epicenter right off the coast of Sumatra, felt like the Grim Reaper had opened his eyes, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Naturally, I refused to believe it. It was the first time Oliver and I had ever been apart. He had gone to Indonesia for a local timber survey, and right before he left, he promised me that he would marry me as soon as he got back. The Morans never made promises they didn't intend to keep. Even though Oliver spent his days goofing off and acting like he didn't care about anything, he had never once broken a promise to me. I was convinced he would make it back. I didn't care if he came back covered in dirt, severely injured, or even paralyzed for the rest of his life. None of that mattered to me. Gradually, even the news stopped covering the disaster. The news cycle moved on. The world found other things to talk about. I went to his funeral. From within a black and white picture frame, he offered a faint, gentle smile to the camera. In that moment, I broke down. sobbing until my throat was raw, feeling as though someone was reaching into my chest and ripping my organs out barehanded. In that moment of utter despair, I finally admitted to myself that he was truly gone. There would never be anyone else in this world who would tug on my hair, furrow his brow, and say, "The world needed saving, you needed saving, and lucky for you. Oliver always gets the hard jobs." I checked into the local guest house late at night. The girl at the front desk let out a long yawn, pointed vaguely toward the room at the very end of the hallway, and immediately fell back asleep. The guest house was small, but it was organized perfectly, and the room was spotlessly clean. As I lay there in bed, the reality finally washed over me. I had left my home and traveled to an entirely foreign country, a place with its own distinct language, culture, and faith. This was where my 23-year-old Oliver rested in eternal sleep. That night, I had a dream. I dreamed of a time when I was 14 or 15. He was wearing a black baseball cap, waiting for me right downstairs outside my building. I had completely overslept and bolted down the stairs in a panic, without even having the time to brush my hair. He shook his fist at me, putting on a harsh, intimidating face, and threatened, "If you're late again, I'm going to beat you up." I just giggled, snatched his cap right off his head, and plopped it onto my own. I stuck my tongue out at him. "Give me a break, you couldn't take me in a fight anyway," I teased. Knowing I was dead right, he shot me a vicious glare. He hopped onto his bike and fired off one last warning. "No more being late. If you're late again, I'm not waiting for you." I know. I laughed as I climbed onto the back seat of his bike, deliberately wrapping my arms tight around his waist. "Who told you to hug me?" His explosive, irritated voice instantly rang out. "Get your monster claws off me. Let me go." All the way down the street, even from a distance, I could still hear him shouting, "Vera, are you listening to me?" The trees along the road were in full bloom, shedding their petals all over the ground. The April sky was a brilliant, endless blue. That was the first time I had dreamed of him since he died. I woke up crying, heartbroken by the realization that those memories were already over a decade old. The next day, I got up before dawn and rented a bicycle to ride around the island. The post-disaster reconstruction had been executed remarkably well. If someone didn't know the history, they would assume this had always been nothing but a peaceful, quiet town. The Indonesian sun was punishingly intense, but I forced myself to endure the sweltering heat by wearing long sleeves and pants. My skin had never been fair to begin with, and standing next to Oliver had always made for a brutal contrast, one pale, one dark, like two total extremes. I don't know if it was because the memory of him suddenly overwhelmed me, or if my body simply couldn't handle the vicious sun anymore, but my hands suddenly went slack, and I tumbled right off the bicycle. When I finally regained consciousness, I was lying in my guest house room. The girl from the front desk let out a massive sigh of relief and immediately started rattling off a rapid string of words that I couldn't understand at all. I just stared at her in total confusion. She sighed again and hurried out of the room. I sat up in bed, and my mind drifted back to a night years ago when I had spiked a fever in the middle of the night. Oliver had dragged me to the hospital for an 4 drip. We sat together on a bench in the corridor, each of us wearing an earbud to listen to music. It was winter, and the hospital hallway was freezing. He took his scarf off his own neck and wrapped it around mine, layer by layer. It still carried his body heat, warming me all the way down to my soul. A nurse passing by had noticed and smiled at me. "You're a lucky girl," she said, "having a boyfriend who treats you so well." Feeling deeply embarrassed, I had just nodded and rubbed my nose, and my swirling thoughts were abruptly cut short by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing from the end of the hall. The steps were light and rhythmic, yet they gave me an inexplicable, profound sense of familiarity. I was sitting in the shadows of the room as he approached from the brightly lit corridor. I heard a man's voice speak. "Hey, you awake?" I completely froze in that split second. It wasn't just because he was speaking English. It was because his voice, though slightly gravelly, sounded exactly like Oliver's. I practically lunged out of bed and saw a man standing in the doorway. The exact moment our eyes met, a violent shudder ripped through my entire body. I took 2 steps forward to get a clear look at his face. His features were handsome and symmetrical, with a shallow scar resting just above his eyebrow. His face looked absolutely nothing like Oliver's. but his physical build was incredibly similar, though my fiance had been just a bit leaner. Perhaps because I had been so deeply consumed by thoughts of him right before this man burst into the room. There was a fleeting fraction of a second where I looked into his eyes and genuinely mistook him for my lost love. I stared at him blankly and asked, "You're American?" He nodded. "You passed out on the road. I own this place." I completely bypassed what he had just said, driven by a sudden, desperate urgency. "What's your name?" His voice rang out clear and bright. "Daniel Mercer." My eyes dropped, a crushing wave of disappointment washing over me. "I'm sorry for the trouble," I murmured. He shook his head. "The sun does this to people. Amanda can take you to get a hat." The moment he finished speaking, a woman peeked out from behind him, her face full of concern. "You feeling better?" She rested her hand on Daniel's shoulder in a way that effortlessly broadcasted their intimacy. She appeared to be a local Indonesian woman. Her skin a shade deeper than bronze, and her facial features were strikingly beautiful. I nodded. "Amanda." Daniel introduced her with a warm smile. "My fiancée." "Your name is Amanda?" I asked. "Yes," she smiled gently. "What a coincidence," I said, offering a weak smile of my own. "My middle name is Amanda too, though I never actually use it." "Really? That feels like fate." After chatting for a few more minutes, I learned that Amanda had originally planned to go to the hospital for a checkup that day. She was 2 months pregnant, but her schedule had been completely derailed because she had to bring me back to the guest house. "I am so incredibly sorry," I apologized sincerely. She just smiled and shook her head. "It's really no problem. Now Daniel can come with me tomorrow." Daniel, who had been translating for me, suddenly lit up at her words. He looked a bit sheepish, but he couldn't hold back a wide grin. "Yeah, I'll go with you tomorrow," he agreed. The moment he smiled like that, I was paralyzed all over again. He had thick eyebrows and large eyes, completely different features, but the sheer expression of his smile was identical to Oliver's. For a moment, I completely forgot to even say congratulations. He didn't notice anything wrong with my reaction, and just kept smiling at me. "We're getting married at the end of the month. If you're still in Indonesia, you should come to the wedding." After they left the room, I lay back down on the bed, feeling my thoughts spiraling into total chaos. Truthfully, I had fantasized countless times about what it would have been like if we had had a child together. I always thought that maybe, if I had a piece of him left, the pain wouldn't be so unbearable. Whenever we talked about the future in the past, he was absolutely adamant about wanting a daughter. I had asked him why, and he replied, "Haven't you heard? Sons take after their mothers. If we have a boy and he's as stupid as you, he'll never even find a wife." I was so furious I gritted my teeth and hurled a pillow right at his head. He just laughed brightly, dodging me. Not the face. After the accident, I went through a long period where I completely lost my appetite, refusing all food and water, surviving entirely on 4 fluids. Missing him drove me to the absolute edge of insanity. Whether I was walking, drinking a glass of water, or listening to music, no matter what I was doing, his face dominated every corner of my mind. When I was in high school, before we officially started dating, I received a love letter from an upperclassman. Not only did the guy write to me, but he also had a habit of cornering me right outside the classroom door. One day, Oliver showed up to school surprisingly early and caught the guy whistling at me inside the classroom. Oliver violently kicked the classroom door open, scaring me half to death. His face was completely devoid of emotion as he threw his backpack onto the floor. He looked dead at the older boy and said, "Get out." That was the first time I had ever seen him get into a real, serious fight. It was only then that I realized all those times I used to bully him and mock him for being a pretty boy, he had just been letting me. When later, I asked him, "Whenever I mess with you, why don't you ever fight back? Didn't you say you don't even treat me like a girl?" "I just can't be bothered with you," he replied. Giving me a sideways glance, I pushed further. "If you can't be bothered with me, then why did you beat him up?" He glared at me fiercely, refusing to give me the answer I wanted to hear. Because his face is ugly and it was annoying my eyes. I smiled, my eyes curving into crescents. "Oliver, if you like me, just say it." He flew into a flustered rage, turning bright red all the way from his cheeks down to his neck. Who says I like you?" When we finally did get together, He acted incredibly smug, crossing his legs and adopting the arrogant posture of a king. Vera, you better think this through, he announced. Now that you're with me, you're only allowed to be with me for the rest of your life. I had spent such a massive portion of my life by his side that he had irrevocably become a permanent part of my existence. I had made him a promise, and because of that, there was absolutely no way I could ever accept anyone else. The following morning, I bumped into Daniel again while eating breakfast at the guest house. He told me his full Indonesian name, which was a massively long string of syllables that I couldn't even begin to memorize. But I loved the sound of it. It was the first time I had ever encountered a name so unique. Amanda was still sleeping in, and he was just waiting for her to wake up so he could take her to the hospital for her appointment. A little while later, she finally emerged. When she saw me, she made a point to warn me against wandering around aimlessly today, especially during the fiercely hot afternoon hours, and then spent a long time outlining the famous local sites, suggesting I wait until evening to explore them. You sound so professional, I commented with a smile. Like a true local expert. It was only later that I learned she used to work as a professional tour guide in the area. Over the past few years, the number of foreign backpackers visiting Indonesia, especially young people from Europe and America, had skyrocketed. Because of this, she ended up switching careers, opening this guest house alongside Daniel. My mind suddenly flashed back to when Oliver first arrived here. He had hired a local guide as well, and I distinctly remembered him complaining over the phone about how incredibly heavy her accent was, making communication an absolute nightmare. I lowered my eyes and looked at the pregnant woman. The Indian Ocean tsunami 3 years ago. Do you remember it? Predictably, a look of profound grief and pain surfaced on her face. I quickly learned that she had lost both of her parents in that horrific disaster. I am so sorry, I said, instantly overwhelmed with guilt. I had a very dear friend who lost his life here in that disaster. There aren't very many Americans who come here, so I thought. It's okay, she said softly, shaking her head. Everything passes in time. After they left the guest house, I wandered back to my room in an absolute daze. Unable to stop myself, I took out the old postcards he had sent me. Ever since he died, I had kept them locked in a tin box. I had tried to burn them several times, but always ended up backing out at the last second. I opened the tin box and flipped through the postcards one by one until I suddenly froze in my tracks. On the back of one specific card, he had rambled on and on about various things before tacking on a final note. My guide here is named Amanda, same as your middle name. Funny how that works. I think about you even from this far away. I clamped my hand over my mouth, bolted out the door, and frantically hailed a taxi. I completely ignored the driver's outrageous, price-gouging fare and ordered him to rush straight to the hospital. Once I got there, I realized I had absolutely no idea where to even begin looking for her. I managed to ask around and find the location of the obstetrics and gynecology department, and I ran all the way there, panting heavily, until I finally spotted her sitting on a bench in the hallway. Before she even had a chance to express shock at my sudden appearance, I cut her off. 3 years ago, when the tsunami hit, did you take in an American tourist? He called himself Oliver Moran. She just looked at me with total bewilderment and shook her head. I let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. The name Amanda was incredibly common. There were probably dozens of women with that name just sitting inside this very building right now. I dragged my feet down the stairs, completely devoid of hope, and just happened to bump into Daniel right after he finished paying the medical bills. He was wearing a green floral shirt, blocking my path. My lungs suddenly seized up, and my heart began hammering against my ribs with impossible, violent speed. I must have gone completely insane, because I looked at him and asked, "You know someone named Oliver Moran?" Oliver Moran. He simply stared back at me, his face utterly blank with confusion. Clinging to the very last, agonizing thread of hope, I asked, "How long have you been here?" He smiled. 7, 8 years now. 7 or 8 years ago. My mind went blank for a second. Back then, Oliver and I were still sitting side by side in the exact same classroom. He never bothered to actually write the essay questions on exams, and I could never solve the final math problem. "It's so hot, and the air conditioning is broken again," I grumbled, furiously fanning myself with my hands. He glanced over at me, casually sliding his ice-cold drink across the desk toward me, yet still finding a way to sound absolutely vicious. Only fat people are afraid of the heat. I am not fat. I snapped. He didn't reply. He just grinned, his eyes deliberately dropping to fixate on my slight stomach pouch. We wore light clothes in the summer, and whenever I sat down, my stomach would bulge just a tiny bit. I glared at him, declaring that this happens to every girl. He just shrugged, a look on his face that clearly said he didn't believe a word of it, and I was so infuriated that I grabbed my fountain pen and relentlessly jabbed him with it over and over. Snapping back to reality, I looked at the man standing right in front of me. "I'm sorry. I had you confused with someone else," I said. "It's all right," he replied. "You'll find whoever you're looking for." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words died in my throat. The next day, refusing to give up, I went to find Amanda again. She and Daniel were busy decorating the guest house courtyard together. Her pupils were stunning, a warm chestnut brown, perfectly round and large like flawless glass marbles. She could speak a little English, and surprisingly, she even knew how to recite a few lines of poetry. In a soft voice tinged with her light accent, she slowly quoted, "Remember me when I am gone away." I was deeply impressed, but completely baffled. "Why this exact poem?" I asked. She turned her head to look at Daniel, who returned her gaze with a gentle smile. The profound affection between them was so obvious that just looking at them made you feel a sense of absolute, tranquil joy, she said, "because he loves it." I immediately looked at Daniel. He just smiled. Offering no further explanation, I stared at the tall man standing before me, my emotions impossibly tangled. The sunlight cascaded across his face, illuminating the smile that lingered on his lips, and once again, my mind violently pulled me back to Oliver in school. Oliver had always been terrible at most subjects, but the absolute only poem he could recite from memory happened to be Christina Rossetti's Remember. And his reason for memorizing it was the exact same as Amanda's, because I loved it. As a teenage girl who had never truly tasted the bitter suffering of real heartbreak, I had memorized countless love poems, naively believing that reciting them would somehow make me understand love better. The summer air was swarming with mosquitoes, and after just standing there talking for a little while, I was completely covered in bites. Daniel chuckled and asked, "Looks like they're all going after you, Miss Holloway. Type A blood." I nodded in absolute defeat, casually asking in return, "And you?" "Oh, Amanda's AB." I stared at his face, a face that was objectively, undeniably different from my fiance's, and for a long time, I couldn't tear my eyes away. A sudden realization slammed into me. Oliver had been type O, too. Out of the corner of my eye, I happened to glance at Amanda. I instantly realized her smile looked incredibly forced. 1,000 questions swirled relentlessly in my mind. The very next day, I asked the girl at the front desk for the name of the travel agency where Amanda used to work. I went there and told the staff that I was searching for the man I loved, who had gone missing in the tsunami 3 years ago. They apologized profusely, explaining that the vast majority of the agency's records had been completely destroyed during the disaster. I reached into my bag and pulled out a photo of the two of us. Because I had obsessively stared at it countless times, and because it had been soaked in my tears over and over again, the photograph was already incredibly worn, faded, and fragile. It was taken on my 20th birthday, during a trip we took together. In the picture, I was leaning my head against his shoulder, smiling so wide my eyes were shaped like little crescent moons. Now, 5 full years had vanished. My youth was entirely over, yet in that photo, he remained forever young and painfully handsome. "Have you seen this person before?" I asked. They shook their heads. But deep down in my bones, I felt an unshakable premonition that they absolutely had to have met him. Because I was operating with an ulterior motive, I constantly sought out Amanda to chat with her, which inevitably meant I frequently ran into Daniel as well. One evening, they cooked dinner and invited me to join them. During the meal, Daniel quietly picked the foods Amanda disliked off her plate and moved them to his own, then painstakingly peeled an apple just for her. "I'm so jealous of you two," I blurted out without thinking. When I used to get sick in the past, Oliver would try to take care of me too. But his caretaking skills were absolute garbage. Not only would he butcher an apple until it was completely mangled and pitted, but he'd peel it down so small that it could be eaten in just 2 bites. He deliberately forced me to eat the exact vegetables he knew I hated, and if I refused, he would ruthlessly snatch the TV remote away from me. I would get so blindingly mad that, in a rush of pure adrenaline, I would lunge forward and forcefully kiss him right on the lips. It would practically cause his brain to short-circuit, leaving him staring at me in total, frozen shock. I would casually pull back, looking completely composed, narrow my eyes at him, and say, "Don't worry, I'll take responsibility for you." I quickly realized that this tactic was wildly effective. Whenever I encountered food I didn't want to eat, or a comic book I desperately wanted to read, all I had to do was kiss him, and he would instantly flush bright red and agree to absolutely any demand I made. While we were dating, plenty of girls tried to start drama with me. They would point their fingers at me and demand to know what on earth he saw in me. I never got angry at them. I genuinely believed that the bond between us was completely impenetrable to outsiders. So, I crossed my arms, perfectly confident, fully expecting him to launch into an endless, passionate speech praising all my virtues. Instead, he thought about it with extreme seriousness for a very long time, finally looked at me with deep sincerity, and said, "Sorry, I honestly couldn't find a single good quality." I almost ripped off my flip-flop and hurled it directly at his head. But not a single person ever asked me what I liked about him. He was handsome, incredibly smart, and came from a prominent family. It seemed like my falling in love with him was simply a natural law of the universe. After he died, I spent a long time thinking about it very seriously, yet I honestly couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was that made me love him so much. Later, someone told me a quote. "If you can't explain it, it's probably love." Thinking about this now, I suddenly felt my heart begin to violently spasm with pain. I pushed back from the table and walked out. Daniel immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong and came outside to check on me. I was standing by the window in the hallway, staring down in a total daze. He tensed up instantly and called out loudly, "Miss Holloway." I turned to look at him. A sudden gust of wind swept through, making the hem of his shirt flutter wildly. He stood there engulfed in blinding golden sunlight. The fierce glare blurred his features, and in that agonizing second, he merged flawlessly with the Oliver of my memories once again. I couldn't hold it back anymore. "Oliver." He looked at me, completely baffled. "Ms. Holloway?" I stared at him, and for some reason, the tears instantly broke free. I began sobbing so hard I couldn't even form a coherent sentence. "Oliver, Oliver." He let out a soft sigh and offered an incredibly apologetic smile. "Ms. Holloway, I'm so sorry for your loss." The next day, I found a leather wallet sitting on a table in the guest house's common lounge. I opened it up and realized it was Daniel's driver's license, which he had accidentally left behind. I was still looking at the ID when I suddenly heard footsteps coming up behind me. When he saw me, he breathed a sigh of relief. "There it is." I smiled and handed the wallet back to him. "You look different from your photo." "Yeah," he chuckled, the deep dimples on his cheeks suddenly visible. "I'd just gotten out of surgery when that was taken. Still healing." I completely froze. "What surgery?" "Reconstructive," he replied, pointing at his own face. "I was caught in the tsunami too. I made it out, but my face didn't. They had to rebuild most of it. The ground seemed to drop out from under me. Countless fragmented memories began flashing violently through my mind, but I couldn't latch onto a single one of them. I felt like I had completely missed an absolutely crucial piece of the puzzle. Was there anything else?" "Your head." I stammered. He looked slightly taken aback. "How did you know?" "Yeah. Head trauma." I lost my memory. I took a massive step backward, my legs giving out completely as I collapsed into a crouch on the floor. "Then how do you know your name is Daniel Mercer?" I demanded. "Amanda told me," he said softly. "She said we fell for each other on the road, that I stayed for her." My eyes were bloodshot as I stared up at him in absolute shock. I desperately wanted to speak, but I realized my body was completely out of my control. I didn't even know how to physically force a sound out of my throat. All I could do was cover my mouth as my tears rained down. I reached out a trembling hand and gripped the hem of his shirt with terrifying strength. A deafening buzzing sound suddenly consumed my ears, and in the very next second, I blacked out completely. On the night before I was scheduled to check out of the guest house, I spotted Amanda out in the courtyard. She was sitting on a rope swing, flipping through a photo album. When she saw me approaching, she smiled brightly and waved me over. "Come look." The album was completely stuffed with photos of her and Daniel. It looked like they had traveled to countless beautiful places together, embracing and smiling flawlessly for the camera in every shot. I stared at the man in those photos, staring at his beaming smile. This was the exact future I had once craved with a madness that nearly destroyed me. I slowly raised my head, my eyes completely dead as I looked at her. "I had a fiance once too," I told her. "We knew each other for nearly 20 years. We grew up together, and we survived so much together. He came here for work, and right before he left, he told me that as soon as he got back, we would get married." She looked at me, a highly complex expression crossing her features. I completely ignored it and kept talking, completely lost in my own world. We even had our entire married life planned out. He was going to cook, and I was going to wash the dishes. We were going to adopt a massive dog and name him Pip. Our bedroom was going to be painted my favorite shade of light blue, and the bed sheets had to have a starry sky pattern. I babbled on, unable to stop. Suddenly, she started screaming. I stared dead into her eyes and spoke in a frighteningly quiet voice. "In this world, there's more than one way to identify a person. I'm not here to argue about whether Daniel Mercer exists. I just want an explanation." She stared back at me in utter terror, her entire body violently trembling as she stuttered out in broken English. "I loved him. It was love at first sight. The tsunami took everything from me. I just needed a reason to keep going. A reason to keep going." I stared at her breathtakingly beautiful face. "Did you ever once stop to think?" I asked, every single syllable designed to butcher her soul, feeling as if my own heart was physically bleeding out, that somewhere far away, someone else lost her absolute reason to keep going because she lost him. She just bit down on her lip and refused to say a word. My emotions completely shattered. I lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders with terrifying force, and screamed hysterically, "What gave you the right?" In the very next second, someone forcefully struck my hands away. Daniel's massive frame forcefully inserted itself between us, physically shielding her behind his back. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated rage. "Miss Holloway, what the hell are you doing?" I stumbled backward 2 steps. I stared at this man. He used to be the person who loved me more than anyone else in the entire world. He used to bend down and carry me on his back, wading through flooded streets, while I rested against his shoulders, genuinely believing that pure happiness was nothing more than that exact moment. He was still alive. He hadn't died. Yet this same man, this man who had loved me so fiercely, was now staring at me with the furious, disgusted eyes of a total stranger, viciously protecting his fiancée from me. What did it genuinely mean to love someone? Was it truly enough just knowing that he was safe, alive, and living a happy life? I clamped my hand tightly over my mouth, fighting with everything I had to keep from sobbing out loud. I kept shaking my head, backing away step by step, before I finally turned and fled from the courtyard. I wasn't invited to their wedding, but my stubborn, broken heart demanded that I go see it anyway. They held the ceremony in a beautiful local park. The bride wore a stunning white gown trimmed in gold and a crown woven from fresh flowers, looking flawlessly beautiful, like a literal fairy. If my fiancé had seen it, he would have undoubtedly rolled his eyes and scoffed. "Who cares? You still won't find anyone better looking than your own boyfriend in the entire world, so just focus on having fun." The priest read passages from the Bible and wrapped a white cloth around the bride and groom's shoulders 24 times, a local tradition physically symbolizing their eternal union. I stood entirely hidden from his view, watching him slide the wedding ring onto his new bride's finger. He smiled so gently, so shyly, gazing with absolute adoration at the woman in his arms before leaning down and kissing her deeply. I doubled over in excruciating agony, violently dry heaving until I actually threw up stomach acid. Standing right there in the brilliant sunlight, the unimaginably handsome man about to become a devoted husband and father. He was my Oliver. He was the Oliver I had known for nearly 20 years. the boy I had loved for nearly 20 years. Yet I was completely powerless to do anything but stand there and watch this heavily blessed, beautiful scene unfold, feeling as though my internal organs had been ripped from my body and viciously crushed into paste. A close friend later asked me, "Why didn't you just tell him the truth?" I could only answer her in a whisper. Because he doesn't remember anymore, and he doesn't love me anymore. To him, all of those memories simply belong to the completely irrelevant past of some random stranger. A stranger named Oliver Moran. He once used a watercolor marker to write directly on my arm, "Oliver loves Vera." I had mocked him endlessly for it. Cheesy. He just glared at me. "Vera, can you literally ever say a single nice thing?" The weather that year had been perfectly clear and bright. I had rested my head on his lap and fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. Oliver loves Vera. The final lines of that poem suddenly echoed clearly in my mind. The lines about how forgetting is infinitely more merciful than remembering. About how it is better to let him forget and let him smile, than to force him to remember and force him to suffer. So this was what that poem truly meant. This was exactly where it belonged. I had checked out of their guest house several days ago, fully preparing to leave Indonesia. On the exact day of my departure, I went back to their guest house for breakfast one last time, and I surprisingly bumped into Daniel yet again. He smiled and handed me a cup of yogurt. "My wife made this. Take it for the road." I smiled back and took it from him. "I'm truly sorry about what happened the other day." I told him that. I looked at him with a gentle smile. His facial features were completely gone, thoroughly erased by surgery, but the unmistakable spirit in his brow still fiercely mirrored Oliver. I just stared at him blankly. "Oliver," I whispered. He didn't understand why I said it, so he just replied warmly, "Safe travels, Ms. Holloway. I hope you find what you're looking for. Why don't you ever go back home?" I suddenly asked. He smiled, his eyes curving into little crescents, revealing the shallow dimples at the corners of his mouth. "That was exactly my Oliver," he said. "That's all in the past now. I love the life I have here." "No," I screamed silently in my heart, completely shattered. "If Oliver ever knew that you were bullying me like this, he would beat you to a pulp." But the truth was, he would never know, because a Vera who no longer had her Oliver was simply no longer Vera at all. "Can you walk with me a little?" I asked. The plants in the guesthouse courtyard were lush and heavy with leaves, overshadowed by massive, towering trees. I stared at the scenery blankly, and all of a sudden, I found it in my heart to forgive everything. If Amanda hadn't been there, he truly would have died entirely alone in those monstrous waves. Buried in a completely foreign land, I turned to the man walking beside me. "You're very lucky," I said. He instantly knew exactly what I meant and offered a shy, genuine smile. "Yeah. Finding Amanda. That's the luckiest thing that ever happened to me." He talked to me extensively about her, completely laying out their entire future. He talked about having kids, and how, once those kids were grown up and sent off to college, the two of them could finally travel the world together. He said he didn't care if they were poor. Just being with the person he loved was its own kind of absolute happiness. He was wearing a silver wedding band on his left ring finger, and the bright metal flashed brilliantly in the sunlight. My journey back home required a layover. When I first arrived in this country, the weather had been miserable and rainy, and now, as I left, the sky remained overcast, refusing to offer a single patch of clear blue. As my plane flew high over the Indian Ocean, it slammed into a brutal air current. The fuselage began severely bucking and violently shaking, causing the passengers in the cabin to shriek in sheer terror. I looked out the small window and saw a blinding, massive expanse of golden light piercing through the heavy clouds. Within that agonizingly bright golden light, lights so fierce it physically made my eyes water, I finally saw my Oliver again. He looked exactly like he did in his early 20s. He was getting ready for his very first job interview, dressed in a perfectly ironed, crisp suit, shamelessly waving me over. "Vera, hurry up and get out of bed. Help me tie my tie." I complained sleepily. "Tie it yourself." "I don't care," he insisted stubbornly. "From now on, you have to tie it for me every single time." He stood right there in the clouds, turning his head to flash me a brilliant smile. I desperately wanted to know what he saw the very moment he closed his eyes in those crushing waves 3 years ago. I wanted to know what his absolute last words were. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was there in that final moment. Oliver and I met when we were just 6 years old, and he vanished when he was 23. Those 17 years in between, those beautiful years where we fiercely loved each other, were all I had left in this entire world, and they were more than enough for me. I couldn't speak a single word of the truth to that man on the island, because he truly wasn't Oliver anymore. He would never be my Oliver again. I metaphorically dropped to my knees on the far banks of the Kruingache River, that tragic, devastating body of water that carried the silent names of countless victims, and I endlessly screamed his name into the void. Oliver. Oliver. The plane suddenly began plummeting violently through the sky. The electrical systems completely failed. The cabin lights frantically flickered, and my ears filled with the horrified, desperate wails of women and crying children. I just sat there and allowed a deeply sorrowful smile to cross my face. Oliver, I finally waited long enough to find you. It's just that you couldn't wait long enough to find me. I tightly covered my eyes and tilted my head all the way back, refusing to let a single tear fall. If he ever found out how heartbroken I was, it would absolutely destroy him, too. And I never, ever wanted him to be sad. And my absolute only regret in this entire life is that we were so incredibly young back then. I foolishly believed that we had massive, endless decades of future ahead of us to waste, and because of that blind arrogance, I actually forgot to look him in the eye and tell him that I loved him. And to tell him that I do, Oliver, Oliver.